Hi there, welcome back to Borderlink Reporters TV. On today's episode, we'll be talking on Merciful Truth. In Merciful Truth, we delve into the undercurrents of global power and expose the hidden agendas shaping our world. Please do not forget to subscribe, like, and share our videos. Today we're diving deep into the murky waters of international relations, exploring the expanding reach of a military alliance forged in the fires of the Cold War NATO. From its humble beginnings as a defensive pact against Soviet aggression, NATO has undergone a dramatic transformation in the decades since the fall of the Iron Curtain. But is this transformation a necessary evolution or a dangerous overreach? Today we're asking the tough questions about NATO's expanding influence, particularly on the continent of Africa. Is NATO a force for good, bringing stability and security to a troubled region? Or is it a neo-colonial force meddling in the affairs of sovereign nations for its own strategic gain? Let's investigate. Rewind to 1949. The world is still reeling from the devastation of World War II, and a new threat is emerging: the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. Enter NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Initially, NATO was all about collective defense, but then the world changed. The Berlin Wall crumbled, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the Cold War ended with a whimper rather than a bang. And so, NATO embarked on a journey of expansion and transformation. And where better to flex its newfound global muscles than Africa? A continent rich in resources, strategically vital, yet grappling with instability, conflict, and underdevelopment. A continent ripe, some might say, for external influence. Now let's be clear, NATO isn't the only player vying for influence in Africa. China's economic footprint is growing, Russia's making strategic inroads, and the ghosts of European colonialism still linger. But NATO, with its military might and Western backing, is a force to be reckoned with. From training missions with African militaries to combating piracy off the Horn of Africa, NATO's presence is increasingly visible. But is it welcome? Is NATO a benevolent partner, helping to bring peace and stability to the continent? Or is it a meddling interloper, more interested in securing its own interests than the well-being of African nations? To answer these questions, we need to delve deeper into NATO's activities in Africa, examining the motives, the actions, and the consequences. Join us as we travel to the heart of the matter, speaking with experts, analysts, and those most affected by NATO's expanding influence. Picture this, it's 1949. The world's still licking its wounds from World War II, but a chill's already settling in the air. The Soviet Union, with its expanding sphere of influence, is the bogeyman on everyone's lips. Communism, that's the threat, the domino everyone's scared will fall. The West, they needed a game plan, a way to stand together against the looming red menace. And that, my friends, is how NATO was born. 12 nations, mostly Western European countries, joined hands with the US and Canada, forming a pact, a promise. An attack on one is an attack on all. It was a time of suspicion, of proxy wars and constant tension. But through it all, NATO stood as this bulwark, this symbol of Western unity against the perceived communist threat. The idea was simple: deter aggression, prevent another devastating war, and for a while you could argue, it worked. Fast forward to the late 80s, early 90s, the world's holding its breath, things are changing, shifting faster than a politician's promise during election season. The Berlin Wall crumbles, the Soviet Union, that giant, fractures and dissolves. The Cold War, the defining conflict of a generation, ends not with a bang, but a whimper. And NATO? Well, you could almost hear the collective sigh of relief, mixed with a dose of now what? See, with the threat gone, the very reason for NATO's existence suddenly seemed, well, outdated. Like a rotary phone in the age of smartphones, or those bell-bottoms some of you might have stashed in the back of your closet. Some folks, they said it's time for NATO to pack it up, hang up its hat. Mission accomplished, right? But others, they saw an opportunity, a chance to reinvent, to rebrand, to take this powerful military alliance and, let's say, diversify its portfolio. Now, the 90s, they weren't exactly a picnic, right? The world, it didn't magically become this peaceful utopia just because the Cold War ended. Ethnic conflicts flared up, terrorism reared its ugly head, and failed states became breeding grounds for instability. NATO, it realized that maybe, just maybe, it could be the world's problem solver, the go-to organization for tackling these new threats. But there was a catch, see? This new world, it was messy, complicated. No more clear-cut good guys and bad guys, just a whole lot of gray areas. This new world, it demanded a new NATO. One that wasn't just about defending territory, but about projecting power, intervening in far-off lands, and promoting, well, what they called democracy and stability. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Remember those former Soviet republics, the ones who used to be on the other side of the Iron Curtain? Well, some of them, they were knocking on NATO's door, eager to join the club, to be on the winning team. And NATO? They welcomed them with open arms, expanding eastward, inching closer and closer to Russia's borders. Now, you didn't have to be a genius to figure out that Russia wouldn't be too thrilled about this whole eastward expansion thing. They saw it as a betrayal, a broken promise, a direct threat to their security. And let's just say it didn't exactly make for a cozy relationship between NATO and the folks in Moscow. So there you have it. NATO, no longer just a defensive alliance but a global player, expanding its reach, flexing its muscles and ruffling some feathers along the way. Okay, remember those awkward teenage years? Trying to figure out who you are, what you stand for, experimenting with new looks, new attitudes? Well, the 90s were kind of like that for NATO. The Cold War was over and the alliance was itching for a chance to prove itself in this brave new world. And wouldn't you know it, opportunity came knocking in the heart of the Balkans. Yugoslavia, a country cobbled together after World War I, well, it decided to go the way of platform shoes and grunge music, out of style and falling apart at the seams. Ethnic tensions, simmering for decades, boiled over into all-out war. Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, they were at each other's throats. The world watched in horror as this humanitarian catastrophe unfolded on their TV screens. And NATO? Well, they saw it as a chance to play peacemaker, to step in and stop the bloodshed. But it was also a slippery slope, a move away from that whole collective defense thing they were known for. This, my friends, was intervention territory. Now the conflict in Kosovo, it was a whole other beast. This time it was Serbia, led by the strongman Slobodan Milosevic, accused of ethnic cleansing against the Albanian population in Kosovo. The world cried foul, and NATO, well, they decided to take things up a notch. Forget peacekeeping, this time it was bombs away. NATO launched a massive air campaign against Serbia, targeting military installations, bridges, even that Serbian state TV station. 78 days of airstrikes without, get this, a UN mandate. Yep, you heard that right. NATO, acting on its own, decided who the bad guys were and dropped some serious firepower. Now, did it work? Well, Serbia backed down, Milosevic eventually faced trial for war crimes, and Kosovo declared independence. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, a messy affair that left a lot of folks questioning NATO's methods and motives. And then came 9/11. The world watched in horror as those planes hit the Twin Towers and everything changed. Suddenly, terrorism was public enemy number one, and NATO, well, they had a new calling, a new enemy to fight. Afghanistan, that landlocked mountainous country halfway across the world, became the battleground in America's war on terror. And NATO? They were right there alongside the US, sending troops, equipment, and expertise to hunt down Osama bin Laden and topple the Taliban regime. This wasn't just some quick in-and-out operation, folks. This was nation-building, a long, drawn-out commitment that lasted for 20 years. 20 years of fighting, of trying to stabilize a country with a long and complicated history. The human cost was immense, for both NATO forces and Afghan civilians. It was a sobering reminder of the complexities and challenges of such an extended conflict. The interventions in the Balkans, the war in Afghanistan, they marked a turning point for NATO. No longer just that Cold War guardian, NATO was now a global interventionist force, willing to project power far beyond its traditional sphere of influence. And, as we'll see in the next part of our series, this new, more assertive NATO would soon set its sights on a new frontier, the African continent. All right, let's turn our attention south to the scorching sands of North Africa, to a land steeped in history and oil, a country ruled for over 4 decades by a man as enigmatic as he was controversial, Muammar Gaddafi. Now Gaddafi, he was a complex character, no doubt about it. To some, he was a brutal dictator, crushing dissent with an iron fist. To others, a champion of Pan-Africanism, a thorn in the side of Western imperialism. Gaddafi's efforts to nationalize Libya's oil industry and provide free healthcare, free housing, and massive irrigation projects for his people made him a target of Western powers. His advocacy to form the United States of Africa, and for Africa to have a single currency backed by gold, also angered the West. Despite being labeled a dictator, Gaddafi's policies significantly improved the lives of ordinary Libyans. However, his refusal to bow to Western interests ultimately led to his downfall. Following his death, Libya descended into chaos, with rival militias and warlords vying for control. The country, once one of the most prosperous in Africa, has become a battleground for foreign interests. Love him or hate him, you couldn't ignore him. By 2011, the Arab Spring was sweeping across North Africa, toppling regimes like dominoes. And Libya, well, it became the next battleground. Protests erupted against Gaddafi's rule, met with a brutal crackdown by government forces. The world watched, horrified, as this internal conflict spiraled into something bigger, something messier. The international community, led by Western powers, they cried foul. A humanitarian catastrophe unfolding, they declared. Gaddafi's gotta go. And who did they turn to? You guessed it, our old pal NATO. Now NATO, they were quick to assure everyone this wasn't about regime change. Oh no, no way. This was about protecting civilians, enforcing a no-fly zone, preventing a massacre. But here's the thing, those airstrikes, they didn't just target Gaddafi's air defenses. NATO planes, they bombed government troops, tanks, command centers, effectively tilting the playing field in favor of the rebels. Many of whom, let's just say, weren't exactly choir boys themselves. Some had ties to extremist groups, others were more interested in grabbing power than in democracy and human rights. But hey, who's keeping track when there's a dictator to topple, right? Section 3. From regime change to chaos, the unraveling of Libya. Well, long story short, Gaddafi, he met a gruesome end, dragged from a drainage pipe and killed by those same rebels NATO had been backing. Mission accomplished, right? Regime change, check. Democracy, not so much. See, Libya, it didn't magically transform into this beacon of stability and prosperity. Instead, it descended into chaos. Armed militias, they carved out their own fiefdoms, fighting for control of oil fields and smuggling routes. The country, it fractured, a failed state, a breeding ground for extremism and instability. And the consequences, they weren't contained within Libya's borders. Weapons, they flooded out of Gaddafi's looted arsenals, ending up in the hands of militants and terrorists across North Africa and beyond. The Sahel region, already struggling with poverty and instability, well, it got a whole lot worse. The human cost, it was immense. Families torn apart, children growing up amidst ruins, a future overshadowed by the specter of conflict. The Sahel's inheritance. Libya wasn't just an isolated incident. Regime change is messy, with unintended consequences. NATO's intervention left a power vacuum, turning Libya into a tinderbox. The Tuareg rebellion in Mali, the rise of Boko Haram in Nigeria, and the spread of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. France launched Operation Barkhane, a costly campaign against extremist groups. The Libyan intervention was a turning point for NATO and Africa. AFRICOM, a new sheriff in town? Hold on to your hats, we're diving into military acronyms. After 9/11, the US decided Africa needed attention in the fight against terrorism. Enter AFRICOM, established in 2007 to counter terrorism and promote peace. Like a superhero landing to save the day, AFRICOM set up in Djibouti near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. But some people started asking questions. Was it about protecting US interests or projecting power? The story is just getting started. Now AFRICOM, they like to keep things hush-hush. They don't exactly publish a list of all their bases and operations, for security reasons. But investigative journalists and those pesky watchdog groups, they've been piecing together the puzzle. And what they found is pretty interesting. Turns out, those US and NATO boots, they're on the ground in a lot more places than you might think. Djibouti, Niger, Somalia, Kenya, Chad, Cameroon, the list goes on. We're talking about drone bases, training camps, logistical hubs, even those secretive little listening posts used to eavesdrop on all sorts of interesting conversations. Now, officially, it's all about fighting terrorism. Those bad guys with beards and AK-47s. But some people, they're not so sure. They point to the fact that a lot of these bases and operations, they're strategically located near, let's just say, areas of vital interest. Oil fields, mineral deposits, shipping lanes, you get the picture. Now, one of AFRICOM's big priorities, it's building up the capacity of African militaries. Training them, equipping them, teaching them how to fight those bad guys, the ones who never seem to run out of recruits or RPGs. And on the surface, hey, that sounds like a good thing, right? Empowering African nations to take care of their own security. But here's the rub. Sometimes those well-trained, well-equipped soldiers, they don't exactly stay loyal to the good guys. Coups happen, governments get overthrown, and those fancy new weapons, they end up in the wrong hands. It's like that old saying, you can lead a horse to water. Well, you know the rest. And then there's the whole issue of proxy warfare. You see, sometimes it's just easier, less messy, to let someone else do your dirty work. So, you train and equip these local forces, give them some air support, maybe a little intel on the side, and let them fight your battles for you. Now let's not be naive, folks. Africa, it's not just about strategic importance and those pesky terrorists. It's also about resources, and lots of them. Oil, gas, minerals, you name it, Africa's got it. And those resources, they've got a nasty habit of attracting attention. Some argue AFRICOM and Western bases aren't just about fighting terrorism, they're about securing access to those resources, making sure they end up in the right hands. But that kind of thinking has a long and troubled history in Africa. It's called neo-colonialism, and it's got a nasty habit of backfiring. Prioritizing resource extraction over sustainable development creates instability. So, is AFRICOM a force for good or fueling instability? It's a complex issue, folks, with no easy answers. All right, folks, let's talk about the French. No, not those stylish folks sipping espressos on the Champs-Élysées, but France's military adventures in Africa, because, you see, they've got quite the history there, a tangled web of colonial baggage and strategic interests. You see, after World War II, those European empires, they started crumbling faster than a croissant left out in the rain. But France, well, they weren't quite ready to let go of their African playgrounds. They held on to those former colonies tight, propping up friendly regimes, securing access to resources, you know, the usual neo-colonial shenanigans. Now, after 9/11, when the war on terror kicked off, France, they found themselves right there alongside the US, flexing their military muscles in places like Mali and Niger, chasing after those elusive terrorists hiding out in the vast Sahara. Whereas some claim they founded those terrorists, and guess who had their back? Yep, good old NATO. Now France, they're not the only ones playing this game. NATO, they're like that popular kid in school, always surrounded by a posse, always looking for new recruits. And in Africa, they've been busy forging partnerships left and right, weaving this intricate web of influence that stretches across the continent. We're talking military training programs, intelligence sharing agreements, arms sales, you name it. They've even got this thing called the Mediterranean Dialogue, a forum for NATO and North African countries to, chat about security issues and share a few croissants. Now NATO, they're quick to point out these partnerships are all about mutual benefit, about helping African nations build their own capacity to address security threats. But some people, they ain't buying it. They see these partnerships as a way for NATO to exert influence, to advance Western interests, and to keep those African militaries firmly under their thumb. So we've journeyed from the battlefields of the Cold War to the sun-scorched sands of the Sahel, exploring the ever-expanding footprint of NATO in Africa. And let's be real, folks, it's a complicated picture, a tapestry woven with good intentions, strategic interests, and those messy, unintended consequences that always seem to crop up. NATO, they argue they're just lending a helping hand, partnering with African nations to combat terrorism, promote stability, and of course, spread those democratic values we all hold dear. But critics, they ain't convinced. They point to a long history of Western intervention in Africa, a history littered with broken promises, rigged elections, and those pesky resource grabs that always seem to benefit everyone but the folks who actually live there. They argue that this whole partnership thing, it's just a fancy way of saying neo-colonialism, a way for Western powers to maintain their grip on Africa's resources and strategic choke points. And let's not forget those proxy wars, those conflicts where African soldiers are often used as pawns in a bigger geopolitical game. Now let's be clear, NATO, they ain't the only game in town. China, with their infrastructure projects and checkbook diplomacy, they're making inroads. Russia, they're flexing their muscles, offering military hardware and security guarantees. Africa, it's become this geopolitical chessboard with everyone vying for influence. But here's the good news. Africans, they ain't just sitting back and letting others decide their fate. There's a growing Pan-African spirit, a desire to break free from old colonial shackles. They're investing in education, technology, and entrepreneurship, building a future where Africa's youth can thrive. So, what's the role of NATO in this new Africa? Well, that's the billion-dollar question, folks. If NATO wants to be a genuine partner, they need to listen to Africans, respect their sovereignty, and support their aspirations for a more peaceful, prosperous future. Because at the end of the day, Africa's destiny is not for outsiders to decide. It's up to the people of Africa to shape their own future. And that's a wrap for this episode of Dispatches. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged with Borderlink Reporters TV, and keep asking those tough questions. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel. Stay blessed.